Hi, thanks for joining me today. My name is Megan and I'm the curator of the Puget Sound Navy Museum. We are located in downtown Bremerton, Washington, right between the ferry terminal and the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. And as you might expect, a big focus of our museum's activities is on the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Though we do cover the naval heritage of the whole region, the museum began in 1954 as the Shipyard's Museum, and it's still a huge part of the local story. Today, I am here to share the history of the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. I want to start by taking a step back in time, all the way back to 1877. Now, that's when Navy Lieutenant Ambrose Wyckoff traveled through the Puget Sound with a survey party. Now, just to set the scene, this area was very rural at that time. Washington wouldn't even be a state for another decade. And at that time, the Navy had no repair or maintenance facilities anywhere near here. So ships had to go either down to San Francisco or all the way up into Canada for repairs. And Lieutenant Wyckoff's survey party noticed that the Puget Sound had a lot of areas that might be good for a shipyard someday. And it had lots of features like deep harbors, a mild climate, and abundant natural resources like timber that would have been important for a naval shipyard of that era. So Lieutenant Wyckoff immediately started advocating to make a naval shipyard here in the Pacific Northwest, a process that would take him for more than a decade. But finally, in 1891, the Navy formally established Naval Station Puget Sound, the Navy's very first ship repair facility here in the Northwest. And Lieutenant Wyckoff was actually sent back to Puget Sound, where he was appointed the first commander of the shipyard, and he set forth buying up all the land that would be needed for this project, eventually buying 145 acres. And of course, construction begins pretty soon after that, and the shipyard's first dry dock is able to open in 1896. Now, dry docks are really essential to a shipyard, because they allow a ship to pull into the dock and then all of the water to be drained away from it so that work can get done under that hull. Dry Dock 2 followed in 1913, and it was 827 feet long and 145 feet wide, making it the U.S. Navy's largest dry dock anywhere in the world at that time. Building a shipyard, of course, also requires lots of buildings on dry land for offices and living quarters and all sorts of mechanical operations. While waiting for their quarters to be built, the shipyard's officers lived aboard USS Nipsic, a Civil War era gunboat that was moored at the Navy Yard Pier to provide housing. The naval officers' quarters, as well as the very first admin building, known as Building 50, were completed in 1896. Building 50 is actually now my museum's building, a very fitting home for us. By 1894, even though there's lots of construction already starting, the shipyard's workforce is just 9 civilian employees and 27 Marines. Can you imagine such a small workforce operating a naval shipyard? Pretty far-fetched. But by 1903, the shipyard actually had more than 1,000 workers. It was by far the largest employer in the whole region. Despite this, things were still pretty quiet during this era. After all, there's no war going on. There's not a ton of ships that have already made it to the Pacific. Of course, this is before the Panama Canal has been built. So there's not a lot of ship repair work to be done in Bremerton. And so the Navy starts thinking, maybe it was a mistake to situate a naval shipyard in such a remote area. And in 1903, they actually threatened to leave Bremerton. And the main driving force behind this was that, of course, the city of Bremerton had sprung out outside the shipyard's gates. And as in many regions where the workforce is primarily young men, there were a lot of bars that popped up. And the Navy was a little hesitant to expose all their sailors to these influences. So they actually went to the Bremerton City Council and demanded that they close all of the bars or the shipyard's going to leave. And of course, the shipyard is so important to the local economy that all the local businesses comply, and the shipyard is here to stay. And in fact, it even starts expanding further. Just before the US enters World War I, the Navy announced plans to expand the shipyard's shipbuilding capabilities. That's when we get Dry Dock 3, which was designed especially for shipbuilding rather than repairs to existing ships. And as World War I begins, this new dry dock allows the shipyard to embark on a very ambitious wartime ship construction schedule. So during World War I, they built 25 submarine chasers and 2 ammunition ships, which were fittingly named Nitro and Pyro. By 1919, the shipyard also completes work on 1,700 other small boats. So it finally really has enough work to keep it afloat for the decades to come. And they even built submarines here. There were 6 of them in all built right around the World War I era. Some launched soon enough to serve in World War I, others launched a little bit too late for that war, but would see wartime service during World War II. Now, during World War I, the shipyard's workforce grows very rapidly, all the way up to about 6,500 employees. And many of these new hires were actually women who would work in the offices as administrative assistants, in the shops operating machinery, and in the docks as rivet heaters and passers, sort of a precursor of Rosie the Riveter that you think of from World War II. And as all the sailors left for duty on board ships, the US Navy actually allows women to start enlisting in the Navy. There are about 11,000 of them who enlisted as yeomanettes, filling jobs that were vacated by men heading off to war. And there were about 200 yeomanettes at the shipyard. And after the end of the war, many of them continued on here as civilian employees. Now, with the end of World War I, things slowed down a bit during the peacetime of the 1920s. Of course, there's not too many orders for new ships flooding into the shipyard. But as we get into the Great Depression, the Navy Yard actually expands. And I think this is a really interesting time of local history, because you think the Great Depression probably negatively impacts most cities about the same. But here in Bremerton, federal money actually floods into the shipyard, financing projects like the newly built machine shop, described at the time as the largest machine shop west of the Mississippi River. And that's also when we get the giant green hammerhead crane, which was built in 1933. It is 200 feet tall. It has a lifting capacity of 250 tons. And though it hasn't been used regularly since the 1990s, it's still a defining feature of the waterfront view today. By the late 1930s, the tide had started to change here at the shipyard, and we were again preparing for the possibility of war. The Puget Sound Navy Yard is now the main West Coast naval shipyard. They get new construction, including dry docks 4 and 5, and the shipyard is really ready for the effort of maintaining the growing Pacific Fleet. By 1939, there are already 6,000 workers here. Unemployment in the rest of the country is in areas as high as 20% as the Great Depression drags on. But here in Bremerton, it's just 6.9%, which really reflects the importance of the shipyard to driving that local economy. And even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, those employment numbers start to grow again. Shipyard employment doubles over the last 6 months of 1941. And again, that's still before the attack on Pearl Harbor. As the war expands in Europe, even though America is still officially neutral, we're already contributing to the war effort. Here, there are workers overhauling battleships and building ships for the British Navy under the Lend-Lease Act. And soon, of course, the shipyard will play a very active role in the war effort. On December 7th, 1941, Japan launches their surprise attack on the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor, and America is officially in the war effort. The Navy Yard reacts very swiftly to news of this attack, quickly mobilizing to support the war effort. And in fact, in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Puget Sound Navy Yard employees assist in cleanup, salvage, and repair operations, with several dozen actually being sent there to help with those efforts. As the only battleship repair yard on the West Coast, Puget Sound Navy Yard employees know they'll have lots of work to do as soon as those damaged ships can get underway. And in fact, Bremerton Shipyard served as the main repair facility for 5 US battleships that survived the Japanese attack. They are USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, USS Nevada, USS California, and USS West Virginia. And they're nicknamed the Ghost Fleet because Japan had declared them sunk after their attack. But the shipyard was able to return them to service, and they came back to haunt the Japanese fleet for the rest of the war. Now, while all of this very important work is going on inside the shipyard gates, Bremerton residents have something else on their minds too. It might seem a little bit strange in hindsight, but at the time there was a very real fear that Japan would attack the mainland US next. And in fact, they worried that Bremerton and the Puget Sound Navy Yard would be viewed as an important strategic target. Shipyard employees immediately start securing both the shipyard and the city of Bremerton for that possibility. There were things like blackouts and gas masks and air raid instructions. There were smoke screens to blanket Bremerton and the Navy Yard so that it couldn't be seen from the water. There were air raid shelters placed strategically around the shipyard grounds. And there were hundreds of barrage balloons moored on both land and water to deter dive bombing. There's an example of one of those in the image on the lower right here. They were giant balloons anchored by thick anchor cables. And the idea was that any approaching aircraft that were coming in flying very low to attempt an attack, they wouldn't be able to see the thick anchor cables, so they'd get all tangled up and disabled. And in those days, everyone knew a friend of a friend whose chimney had been taken out by a barrage balloon that had come unmoored during high winds. With war declared and the city protected from potential attacks, the shipyard starts operating around the clock. And the shipyard is in fact perhaps best known for its activities during World War II, because it was among the only places on the West Coast that could repair the Navy's largest warships. So Bremerton's Puget Sound Navy Yard played a significant role in constructing, repairing, overhauling, and maintaining the US Navy's Pacific Fleet during the war. Now, its primary mission was to repair any of the warships that had been damaged in battle in the Pacific. And their goal was really to repair and overhaul these ships so that they could get back to service as quickly as possible because they were so needed for the war effort. Now, to support this mission, shipyard employees pioneered new ways to expedite the repair process. One of my favorite examples of this is USS New Orleans. And that's the photo on the left here. In November of 1942, she lost her entire bow. After stopping in Sydney, Australia to have a temporary one installed, a project that reportedly involved palm tree logs, USS New Orleans began sailing backwards, making her way very slowly to Bremerton. And in the meantime, here in Bremerton, a new bow had already been built for her, using plans from her sister ship, USS Astoria, that had coincidentally been built here in the 1930s. Now, when New Orleans arrived at the shipyard, it was discovered that the new bow was out of line by just 1/8 of an inch, which is really amazing when you picture the giant scale of a warship. So soon, USS New Orleans was as good as new and sent back out to the fleet. As you can imagine, with all of these very important projects at the shipyard, there was quite the labor shortage. On the eve of World War II, there were about 10,000 workers here, but soon a national recruitment campaign encouraged people to come to Bremerton and join the shipyard from all over the country. And so about 300 potential new hires arrived every single day during the war years. Some had never even seen the ocean before, so of course they marveled at the huge ships that were docked here. There were jobs for anyone who wanted one, and there were about 32,000 workers at the shipyard by 1945. Many of these new employees, of course, were women. Women made up about a quarter of the workforce at the shipyard during World War II. There were entire families working here, sometimes 3 generations at once. And of course, many were the mothers and wives of soldiers or sailors. Other women had themselves enlisted in the Navy, though most women defense workers were civilians. Some had become waves, or women accepted for volunteer emergency service. And there were about 250 waves stationed here in Bremerton during World War II. Of course, all these new workers need somewhere to stay. And with all these new workers heading here, Bremerton's population tripled in just 3 years. Bremerton in 1940 is a pretty small town, about 15,000 people. But by the war's end, some estimates placed Bremerton's population as high as 80,000. Can you imagine living through that kind of change in so few years? Now, this town was absolutely flooded with war workers, sailors, and soldiers. There were several federal housing projects to provide homes for all of these war workers, but it was never enough. Town residents also made room for workers in their attics, their garages, but the housing demands remained so great that there were also workers living in tents and trailers and even in hastily converted chicken coops. Within the shipyard gates, of course, the shipyard buzzes with activity 24/7. And the workers were told not to talk about their work as soon as they left the shipyard. Their construction and repair records were no secret. In all, they repaired 26 battleships, some more than once, along with 18 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and 79 destroyers. They also built 53 entirely new vessels, including 5 aircraft carriers. And they overhauled, repaired, or fitted out another 400 vessels. All of these important contributions enabled the Pacific Fleet to participate in crucial naval battles and, of course, ultimately to win the war in the Pacific. And almost immediately following the end of the war in 1945, war industries start slashing their workforce. And many of the workers actually welcomed the time off. They'd been working 6 days a week for several years now, and they were really ready for a break. So hundreds start quitting within a week of Japan's surrender. And by 1946, the shipyard's workforce drops all the way down to 9,000 from that wartime high of 32,000. But their wartime job wasn't over quite yet. Immediately following the end of the war, they transitioned to a new mission, Operation Magic Carpet, where they converted ships into troop transports. Because of course, with the end of the war, there were hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors and personnel all over the world, and they were really eager to get home as quickly as possible. So shipyard employees immediately start post-war work to install bunks to bring them home as quickly as possible. And following the end of that work in late 1945, the Puget Sound Navy Yard is renamed the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, and its mission changes to deactivating the Pacific Fleet vessels that were no longer needed in the active fleet with the end of the war. They later activate many of those ships for the Korean conflict in the early 1950s, and then deactivate them again when that's over a few years later. In the 50s, the shipyard also enters a new era of shipbuilding with the construction of 2 guided missile frigates, USS Kuntz and USS King. Into the 1960s, they continue to build a handful of these ships, including USS Seattle, a supply ship that remains among the largest US Navy ships ever built on the West Coast. But perhaps its most important work during the post-World War II period is modernizing aircraft carriers. There were a lot of lessons learned from World War II, so they do some modernization that includes converting conventional flight decks to the angled decks used by newer aircraft and installing steam catapults for aircraft launching. The arrival of the nuclear era in the 1950s and 60s brings great change and new challenges to the shipyard. With the 1954 launching of the first nuclear-powered submarine, USS Nautilus, the shipyard's primary mission shifts yet again. And since then, the shipyard's primary workload has been maintaining, refueling, repairing, and eventually recycling nuclear-powered submarines and surface ships. A couple of historical milestones helped to propel it in this new direction. In 1961, the shipyard was designated a submarine repair facility. By 1965, the shipyard was officially capable of repairing nuclear-powered vessels. A major addition to the shipyard as they geared up for the nuclear era was Dry Dock 6. Opened in 1962, it is 1,180 feet long, 180 feet wide, and 60 feet deep. This makes it large enough to hold the latest nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. And in fact, the Navy's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, USS Enterprise, was overhauled here in the 1970s. Even today, 60 years after it was built, it remains the largest dry dock owned by the US Navy. Now, in addition to maintaining nuclear vessels throughout their lifespan, the shipyard is also involved when they inevitably reach the end of their useful life. Starting in the 1980s, the shipyard pioneered a program to safely and efficiently recycle decommissioned nuclear-powered ships. It is the first and only US Navy facility in the world to provide these services. And of course, another very important role for the shipyard in the modern era is as the home port of nuclear aircraft carriers. This role began in 1987 with the arrival of USS Nimitz. And over the years, she's been replaced by USS Carl Vinson, then USS John C. Stennis. And just a couple years ago, USS John C. Stennis left us, but in exchange, USS Nimitz has returned. Today, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard has the only West Coast dry dock that is capable of handling these giant Nimitz-class aircraft carriers. Today, the shipyard covers 344 acres of land and 338 acres worth of water. It has 6 dry docks, 9 piers, and 382 buildings. Today, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard is the largest shipyard on the West Coast and one of Washington State's largest industrial facilities. It just turned 130 years old this past September, and over that time, thousands of ships have been built, repaired, and overhauled here. Today, Kitsap County has the 3rd largest US Navy concentration in the country, behind only Norfolk and San Diego, in large part thanks to the shipyard and Lieutenant Wyckoff's idea all those years ago. Thank you for tuning in today. If you have not already visited the Puget Sound Navy Museum, I hope you'll have a chance to stop by soon. Again, we are located in downtown Bremerton, Washington. We are open every day except Tuesdays, and admission is always free. Thank you.